In the name of the one who lived, died, and rose for us. Amen.
Amen.
Today's passage from the book of Exodus is by sure among the top 10 most familiar and strange passages in the entire Bible, and it has such a rich history of interpretation. There's, of course, my grandparents' favorite, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston, and I have to tell you, I watched a little on YouTube yesterday, and the hair and makeup department outdid themselves. After this scene, Charlton just comes down to find his wife and his brother, and this hair has all this life after his encounter at the burning bush. The version of this story that was more meaningful to me, I was barely a kid, the Prince of Egypt animated version of this came out in 1998. I had already turned 18, but it feels like that film represents my generation. And having rewatched the scene that's depicted in today's passage, again on YouTube yesterday, I noticed how the version of this animated film conveys so well because it's more relatable. First of all, they don't render God's words in the King James Version. But also, this version really brings to life what's going on here in the text, in the story. Because there's both a corporate action that God is taking here that relates to the overall history of salvation. But the film, The Prince of Egypt, does such a good job at conveying the personal struggle and component of Moses. So, on the one hand, the corporate overarching history of salvation, as it's been revealed to us in the Bible, it's playing out here in this scene, where God is fulfilling the promises that God has made to Moses' ancestors. If you were with us in church last week, you heard me preach about Abraham and Sarah. They are our forebears of faith, and they were called by God out of their experience of barrenness. And they set out on a pilgrimage of hope based on nothing other than what God promised them. And in the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible, God made 3 promises to Abraham and their descendants. One, that they would have descendants, that their descendants would number more than the stars in the sky that you could possibly count. 2, that they would be given a land, a place to belong, a home. And 3, that their people would enjoy a special covenantal relationship with God. So on the one hand, here in this Exodus scene and in the rest of the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, God's promises to Moses' ancestors begin this process of fulfillment. And then on the other hand, there's this personal stuff. This very personal and individual narrative of Moses, who, though is an Israelite himself, was unknowingly adopted and raised as an Egyptian. He was raised in none other than Pharaoh's household, the king of Egypt. And as a result, he was spared from the experience of slavery and oppression, which his people, the Israelites, suffered at the hand of the Egyptians. And it was only when, as an adult, that Moses ventured out of the palace that he finally came to see with his own eyes the suffering of his people that the Egyptians were causing. And so he fled. And where our story picks up today, he's out in the adjacent kingdom of Midian. And he's married by now. And he is now married to the priest of Midian, who were shepherd family. And so he's out tending the flocks. I mention all this context because I think that these dual concerns of both the corporate, communal story of salvation that's happening and the individual story of Moses, they help us see how the Spirit is still speaking to us through this story calling us to a communal and a personal experience of liberation. So, to recap the story, and again, go rewatch the Prince of Egypt film, because there you'll see how a sheep escapes, and so he wanders into this cave, and the whole pace of the story just slows down with real intention. And he sees this bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed, and he's just mesmerized. The first thing he does is he takes his staff and he sticks it in the flames to see what will happen. And he takes the staff out, and it's not on fire. And reluctantly, he then places his hand in the flames, and it doesn't cause him any pain. And then we hear God's voice softly, like a whisper, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he responds. And here in the film, they go out of order, but I think it's so effective. He says, "Remove your sandals, for the place you're standing on is holy ground." And then they show in slow motion how the pebbles on the ground are swept away by the wind. Moses responds first by saying, "Who are you?" And the Prince of Egypt film gives us the climax of the story at the very top. "I am who I am. I am the God of your ancestors." And it's as if, because God revealed God's identity, Moses, too, was confronted with his own identity. So the film does these flashbacks of voices when Moses was discovering who he was, though he had been raised by the Egyptians. It's revealed to him that he is a Hebrew. He is one of the family of those who are being oppressed outside the palace walls. Only then does Moses remove his sandals. And as the film keeps going through this story that we've read in the text, they continue to interweave both the communal concern of what God is doing here and the personal story of Moses. First, there's this lament that happens, because Yahweh says, "I have observed the misery of my people. I have heard their cry. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." The most important three verbs here in this part of the story is that God sees their oppression. God hears the Israelites' cries. God knows intimately their pain. And this initial impetus for God's response is evoked by the Israelites crying out. It's their tradition of lamenting to God, to being honest with God, that serves as this catalyst of God responding. And then the personal of Moses comes in, because as Yahweh announces that God sees, God knows, God hears, Moses too is seeing and hearing and knowing the pain and the suffering that he has been spared. And it shows these flashbacks of Moses encountering the suffering of his people for the first time. It shows the flashbacks of Moses killing an Egyptian soldier and then fleeing and running away. So not only does God see, hear, and know the people's pain, God also will not let Moses look away from the suffering or relinquish his personal responsibility to do something about it. Then the story ends with this response to God's call for Moses himself to be an agent of liberation. "So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." And so beautifully read by Annie, you heard the "you" emphasis. I will bring you. And in the text we have today, it's a shorter version. If you read the rest of the chapter, right here we have the first two of 5 objections that Moses raises with God. Here are just the first 2, but Moses does this back and forth with God 5 times, coming up with everything that he can think of to convey to God that, no, I'm not your person. This is not for me. But God insists that I will be with you, and I have chosen you to do this. Which brings us to how this applies to us today. I hope you're seeing how these 2 aspects of the story, the corporate and the individual, help us encounter this story too in ways in which we can see the communal call to participate in liberation and our own individual call from God. God sees, hears, and knows of the suffering and pain of us today. Like the Israelites, our cries and our laments evoke God's attention. God sees the systemic oppression of the people in our own time. God hears the cries of those in pain, like the people of Ukraine, who find themselves in the midst of war and violence. God knows intimately that Pharaoh's economy of extracting from the people more and more, that value is still alive today. God knows intimately the pain of those who suffer the most from that economy and from our collective unwillingness to embrace an economy of neighborliness and generosity. But there's also a way that this text is speaking to each of us here today. Individually, God calls to us to be agents of liberation. Yesterday, about 30 of us gathered here in the pews and online to conclude a many-month-long, 10-session-long journey of examining race and racism. It's a program called Sacred Ground that 30 or so of us have been journeying on since last October, and we came together to mark the ending of that phase of our work at least, and we reflected on what have we learned and what do we feel called to next. Among the learnings that we kind of cataloged and tried to put into overarching themes is that the problem of race and racism is way worse than I thought, right? That was one of my realizations, that I thought I knew something about how our country is systemically wrapped up in this story of how we've systematically othered people. But it's way worse than I thought. It profoundly punctuates every aspect of our history. And another learning, that good intentions are not enough. So white people socialized as white, like Moses, cannot flee. We cannot flee from our complicity in participating in these systems. And we cannot look away. We cannot look away from the prejudice and the bias and indeed our own racism that is unavoidable because it's in the air we breathe and the water we drink. God's revelation to us of our ancestors is a reminder of the evil that though we may not own slaves today, some of our ancestors did. Both communally and individually, God calls us to be agents of liberation, my friends. And so, following what the story here in Exodus reveals, there's 3 things that we can do. 1, expect God to be a mystery. Expect God to show up in these mysterious moments and places, these unexpected experiences in our lives, like the burning bush. Do we pause long enough to listen to the voice of God, calling us each by name? Do we take off the sandals from our feet to stand on holy ground? Do we make space in our lives on a daily basis, outside of coming to church on Sunday, to pray, to experience God in nature, in a loved one, even in a stranger? The second task is to take part in lament. Are we telling the truth to ourselves and to God about the pain that we and others are experiencing? Do we honestly tell God, not conclude that, oh, the messiness, that's not for God, I'm not allowed to complain to God, but to come honestly to prayer and participate here in a communal sense of crying out to God to evoke God's attention in our need, our continuous need for liberation. And third, to take action, to respond to this call that God places on each of our hearts. What bold and holy desire has God placed on your heart? What is God inviting you to let go of, thereby liberating you from your personal despair? Or how is God calling you to take part in a communal action, whether it's here at St. Margaret's through our many ministries or in some other communal context that you're a part of, taking part in a group effort in pursuing justice together? As you do these three things, to encounter God, to lament, to take action, remember that they're not all done at once, and they're not all accomplished in this life. And remember that Moses objected 5 times, and it's expected that we will have doubts. It's expected that we will fail. But hear the words that God spoke to Moses. I see, hear, and know your pain, and I will be with you. Amen.